Some ancient buildings were not merely admired. They were economic centers, political symbols, and places where a city imagined itself under divine protection. In the ancient world, there was one such building that stood taller and more magnificent than almost anything human hands had ever raised: the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. It was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and yet today almost nothing of it remains. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your pillow, we will walk together through the warm marble corridors of that vanished temple and learn how it rose, how it burned, how it rose again, and how, in the end, even stone and gold must yield to time. Welcome to Let's Learn While You Sleep. Tonight, the air is still, and the world beyond your window has gone soft and quiet. Let us travel together across 25 centuries and thousands of miles to a place where the Aegean coast curves gently into what is now Western Turkey. There, in the ancient city of Ephesus, stood a temple so vast, so lavishly adorned, that travelers who had seen the pyramids of Egypt and the walls of Babylon still spoke of it with breathless wonder. The Temple of Artemis was not merely a house of worship. It was a treasury, a place of political asylum, a center of commerce, and one of the most celebrated architectural achievements of the ancient Mediterranean world. Over the next gentle while, we will explore its origins, its extraordinary design, the catastrophic fire that destroyed it, the even grander structure that replaced it, and the long, slow decline that left nothing but a single, lonely column standing in a marshy field. Let your breathing slow, let your body grow heavy, and let the story carry you. To understand the Temple of Artemis, we must first understand the goddess it honored and the city that built it. Artemis, in the Greek tradition, was the goddess of the hunt, of wild animals, of the moon, and of childbirth. But the Artemis worshipped at Ephesus was something older and stranger than the lithe huntress familiar from later Greek mythology. The Ephesian Artemis was a fertility deity whose origins likely stretched back into Anatolian religion long before Greek colonists arrived on these shores, perhaps as far back as the Bronze Age. Her cult image, which ancient writers described and which later Roman copies suggest, depicted a figure adorned with rows of rounded protuberances. Scholars have debated for centuries whether these represent breasts, eggs, bull testicles used in sacrifice, or some other symbol of abundance entirely. What is certain is that the Ephesian Artemis was a goddess of nourishment, protection, and the wild creative power of nature herself. Ephesus, the city that grew around her worship, occupied a privileged position on the western coast of Anatolia, in the region the Greeks called Ionia. By the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, Ephesus had become one of the wealthiest cities of the Greek world, enriched by trade routes that connected the Aegean Sea to the vast interior of Asia Minor. Ships arrived bearing goods from Egypt, Phoenicia, and the islands of the Cyclades. Caravans brought gold, spices, and textiles from the east. The city sat at a crossroads of cultures, and its temple to Artemis became, in many ways, a reflection of that cosmopolitan wealth. The earliest sacred structures on the site appear to have been modest, perhaps open-air altars or small shrines, as archaeological evidence from the site suggests layers of construction stretching back centuries before the grand temple we remember. But by the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, the people of Ephesus, along with their powerful patron, the Lydian king Croesus, decided to build something that would announce their city's greatness to the entire known world. And so, the story of the great temple begins, not with stone alone, but with ambition, with devotion, and with staggering sums of gold. The construction of the first great Temple of Artemis is generally dated to around 550 before the Common Era, and it was a project of breathtaking scale. The ancient writer Pliny the Elder, writing centuries later in his Natural History, recorded some of the temple's dimensions, and while we should treat ancient measurements with a degree of caution, the picture they paint is unmistakable. This was one of the largest buildings in the Greek world. The temple measured roughly 115 meters in length and 46 meters in width, according to Pliny's account, and it was surrounded by a forest of tall Ionic columns, perhaps 127 of them, each standing approximately 18 meters high. These were not rough-hewn pillars. They were works of art in themselves, many of them carved with elaborate reliefs at their bases, a feature known as columnae caelatai, or sculpted columns, which was highly unusual in Greek architecture. The man credited with overseeing this extraordinary design was the architect Chersiphron of Knossos, who, according to ancient sources, worked alongside his son Metagenes. One of the great engineering challenges they faced was transporting the massive column drums and architrave blocks from distant quarries to the marshy site of the temple. The Roman architect Vitruvius later wrote that Chersiphron devised an ingenious method. The column drums, being cylindrical, were fitted with iron pins and wooden frames so they could be rolled like great wheels across the landscape, pulled by teams of oxen. For the heavier rectangular blocks, a different approach was reportedly used, involving a rolling cradle of timber. Whether these specific accounts are entirely accurate or partly legendary, they speak to the genuine engineering ingenuity that the project demanded. The funding for this immense undertaking came in significant part from Croesus, the last king of Lydia, whose legendary wealth gave rise to the expression still used today, rich as Croesus. Croesus ruled from the city of Sardis, not far from Ephesus, and his contributions to the temple were commemorated in inscriptions on some of the column bases, fragments of which were discovered during 19th century excavations by the British archaeologist John Turtlewood. These inscriptions, now held in the British Museum, provide some of the earliest surviving examples of a royal patron's name carved into a Greek sacred building. For more than 2 centuries, the Temple of Artemis stood as one of the crowning achievements of Greek architecture, a place where pilgrims and merchants arrived from across the Mediterranean to offer prayers, deposit wealth, and marvel at the sheer audacity of what human craft could accomplish. The temple functioned not only as a religious sanctuary, but also as a kind of bank. Individuals, cities, and even foreign rulers deposited treasure within its walls, trusting in the divine protection of Artemis to keep their wealth safe. This practice was common in the ancient Greek world. Temples often served as repositories of communal and private wealth, and the inviolability of sacred ground provided a form of security that no human vault could match. The temple also served as a place of asylum. Those who fled persecution or vengeance could seek refuge within its precinct, and by ancient custom they could not be seized there. This right of asylum, known in Greek as asilia, made the temple a powerful political institution, for the priests and the city of Ephesus effectively controlled who received protection and who did not. And then, On a night in the year 356 before the Common Era, the unthinkable happened. A man named Herostratus set fire to the temple. According to ancient sources, most notably the historian Theopompus, Herostratus confessed under torture that his sole motivation was a desire to be remembered, to achieve a kind of immortal fame by destroying something irreplaceable. The Ephesians were so horrified by this motive that they passed a decree forbidding anyone to speak his name, a punishment the Greeks called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. And yet, ironically, the very attempt to erase his name ensured that later writers recorded it, and Herostratus is remembered to this day as a symbol of destructive vanity. Ancient tradition also holds that the fire occurred on the very night that Alexander the Great was born, in the summer of 356 before the Common Era. The historian Plutarch later noted that Artemis was said to have been too busy attending Alexander's birth to save her own temple, a poetic conceit to be sure, but one that captures the ancient Greek love of meaningful coincidence. Destruction of the temple might have been the end of the story, but the Ephesians were not a people easily defeated by catastrophe. Within years of the fire, they began planning an even grander replacement on the same sacred site. The rebuilding effort was enormous, and it would take decades to complete, but when the second Temple of Artemis finally stood in its full glory, it was, by all ancient accounts, more magnificent than the first. The new temple was constructed on a raised platform, or crepidoma, that elevated the entire structure above the marshy ground and gave it an even more imposing presence. Ancient sources suggest the new building was roughly the same footprint as its predecessor, but stood on a higher base of step marble, making it appear to rise from the earth like a great stage set for the gods. The architect most often credited with the rebuilding is Scopas of Paros, though some ancient texts also mention contributions from other master builders. Scopas was renowned not only as an architect, but also as one of the finest sculptors of the 4th century before the Common Era, and his involvement suggests that the new temple was conceived as a total work of art, architecture, sculpture, and painting woven into a single harmonious whole. The sculptor Praxiteles, one of the most celebrated artists of the ancient world, is said to have contributed altar decorations, and the painter Apelles, who was famous for his portrait of Alexander the Great, may have contributed painted panels. When Alexander himself passed through Ephesus in 334 before the Common Era during his campaign against the Persian Empire, he offered to finance the completion of the temple, requesting only that an inscription record his contribution. The Ephesians, according to the historian Strabo, politely declined, reportedly saying that it was not fitting for one god to dedicate a temple to another, a diplomatic refusal that flattered Alexander while preserving the city's pride and autonomy. The completed second temple became even more famous than the first, drawing visitors from across the Hellenistic world and later the Roman Empire, and it stood as the greatest monument of Ephesus for centuries to come. Let us pause here for a moment and consider with quiet wonder the economics of a building like the Temple of Artemis. In the ancient world, a great temple was not merely an expense, it was an investment, a generator of wealth that could sustain an entire city for generations. Pilgrims arriving at Ephesus needed food, lodging, and transport. They purchased small votive offerings, terracotta figurines of Artemis, miniature silver shrines, garlands of flowers, and animals for sacrifice. These purchases supported a vast network of artisans, merchants, innkeepers, and priests. The New Testament itself, in the Acts of the Apostles, preserves an echo of this economy. In roughly the year 57 of the Common Era, the Apostle Paul's preaching in Ephesus reportedly provoked a riot led by a silversmith named Demetrius, who argued that Paul's new religion threatened the livelihood of those who made silver shrines of Artemis. Whatever one makes of the theological dimensions of that story, the economic anxiety it describes was entirely real. The temple also functioned as a lending institution. Deposits of gold, silver, and other valuables were held within the sanctuary, and evidence suggests that the temple's administrators extended loans at interest, much as a modern bank would. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described the Temple of Artemis as a place of extraordinary financial activity. This combination of religious authority and economic power made the temple indispensable to the life of Ephesus. To attack the temple was to attack the city's prosperity. To honor it was to participate in a system that enriched nearly everyone. The cult of Artemis was not sustained by faith alone. It was sustained by a web of mutual benefit that bound worshipper, priest, merchant, and civic authority into a single, interdependent community. And this, perhaps, is one of the most important lessons the Temple of Artemis offers across the millennia. That in the ancient world, the sacred and the economic were not separate realms, but deeply, inextricably intertwined, each lending strength and legitimacy to the other. As centuries turned, the Temple of Artemis witnessed the rise and fall of empires. After Alexander the Great's conquests reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 4th century before the Common Era, Ephesus passed through the hands of his successors, the Diadochi, and became part of the Seleucid Empire, then the Kingdom of Pergamon, before eventually falling under the dominion of Rome in 133 before the Common Era, when Attalus III of Pergamon bequeathed his kingdom to the Roman Republic. Under Roman rule, Ephesus flourished as never before. It became the capital of the Roman province of Asia and grew into one of the largest cities in the entire empire, with a population that may have reached 200,000 or more at its peak. The temple remained the spiritual heart of the city throughout this period, and Roman emperors, ever mindful of the political value of religious patronage, honored it with gifts and protections. And yet, beneath this surface of prosperity, slow forces were gathering that would eventually bring the temple's story to an end. The harbor of Ephesus, which had been the source of the city's commercial wealth, was gradually silting up. The Cayster River, which flowed past the city, deposited sediment year after year, and despite repeated dredging efforts, the harbor grew shallower and the coastline crept further away. This environmental process, which unfolded over centuries, would eventually strangle the city's maritime trade and contribute to Ephesus's long decline. Meanwhile, a new religion was spreading across the Roman world, one that would prove far more transformative than any silting harbor. Christianity, born in the Roman province of Judea, reached Ephesus early. The Apostle Paul spent roughly 3 years in the city, according to the Acts of the Apostles, and the Epistle to the Ephesians, attributed to Paul, became one of the foundational texts of the early church. Ephesus was also later associated with the Apostle John and, by some traditions, with Mary, the mother of Jesus. The seeds of a profound cultural transformation had been planted in the very shadow of Artemis's great temple. Final centuries of the Temple of Artemis are a story of slow erosion rather than sudden catastrophe. As Christianity grew from a persecuted minority into the official religion of the Roman Empire, a transformation formalized under Emperor Theodosius I in the late 4th century of the Common Era, the old pagan temples found themselves increasingly marginalized. Imperial edicts prohibited pagan sacrifice and closed temples across the empire. The Temple of Artemis, once the pride of an entire civilization, became a target rather than a treasure. The exact sequence of the temple's destruction is not entirely clear from the historical record, and scholars have debated which events were most decisive. What is known is that by the late 4th or early 5th century, the temple had been significantly damaged or demolished. Some ancient sources attribute part of the destruction to a Gothic raid in 262 of the Common Era, when Germanic tribes sacked parts of Ephesus during a period of broader instability in the Roman Empire. Others emphasize the role of Christian authorities in dismantling the temple and repurposing its materials. Many of the temple's magnificent marble columns and carved blocks were hauled away and incorporated into new Christian buildings, including, according to some accounts, the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, completed in 537 under Emperor Justinian. Whether specific Artemision columns were actually used in Hagia Sophia remains a matter of scholarly discussion, but the broader pattern is well attested. Throughout the late Roman and Byzantine world, the stones of pagan temples were recycled into churches, city walls, and civic buildings. The site of the temple itself gradually sank into the marshy ground from which it had once risen so proudly. Silt from the Caister River covered the remains. The marble was scavenged, the gold was melted, and within a few centuries, the exact location of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was entirely forgotten, buried beneath centuries of sediment and silence. The land returned to marsh and farmland, and the goddess who had once protected Ephesus was remembered only in books. For more than 1,000 years, the Temple of Artemis slept beneath the earth, as lost and silent as a dream you cannot quite recall upon waking. And then, in the 19th century, the age of archaeology arrived, and with it came a stubborn and determined Englishman named John Turtle Wood. Wood was a railway engineer working in the Ottoman Empire, and his passion for classical antiquity led him to begin searching for the lost temple in 1863. The task was enormously difficult. The ancient city of Ephesus had been extensively excavated by others, but the temple's location, which was actually outside the main city walls, had been entirely forgotten. Wood spent year after year digging trial trenches in the swampy landscape around Ephesus, often working in dangerous conditions, plagued by malaria, beset by flooding, and sometimes threatened by local bandits. His funding from the British Museum was modest, and there were long periods when it seemed the search would have to be abandoned entirely. But Wood persevered, and in 1869, after 6 years of searching, he finally struck pavement, the great marble floor of the temple's foundation, buried some 6 meters below the surface. Subsequent excavations revealed fragments of sculpted columns, pieces of the ornate architrave, and portions of the foundation walls. Among the most important finds were the column bases bearing the inscription of Croesus, confirming that wood had indeed found the archaic temple funded by the legendary Lydian king more than 2,400 years earlier. Later excavations, most notably those led by the Austrian archaeologist David George Hogarth in the early 20th century, uncovered a remarkable deposit of votive offerings buried beneath the temple floor: gold jewelry, electrum coins, ivory figurines, and amber beads, a cache now known as the Artemision deposit, which provided extraordinary insight into the wealth and international connections of the archaic sanctuary. These artifacts, along with Wood's column fragments, reside today in the British Museum, quiet witnesses to a vanished splendor. And so we come to the question that lingers in the quiet air of this night. What was the Temple of Artemis truly, when we step back far enough to see it whole? It was, of course, a feat of architecture, one of the grandest buildings ever constructed in the ancient Mediterranean. Its forest of Ionic columns, its sculpted friezes, its painted and gilded surfaces would have presented a spectacle of color and light that our modern image of pale, stripped-down classical ruins can scarcely convey. We tend to imagine Greek temples as austere white marble, but scholarship over the past century has made abundantly clear that ancient Greek buildings were vividly painted. Blues, reds, golds, and greens adorned their surfaces, and the Temple of Artemis would have been no exception. It was also a political instrument. The city of Ephesus drew power and prestige from the temple's fame, using its sacred status to negotiate favorable terms with whatever empire happened to hold dominion at the time: Lydia, Persia, the Hellenistic kingdoms, Rome. The right of asylum granted by the temple gave Ephesus a unique form of political leverage, and the wealth deposited within its walls made the city a financial center of genuine importance. But perhaps most profoundly, the temple was a place where human beings reached towards something beyond themselves. The goddess Artemis, in her Ephesian form, represented the wild, generative power of nature, the force that brings forth life from the soil, that guides animals through the forest, that governs the mysterious rhythms of birth and growth and renewal. To stand before the temple, to pass between those towering columns and enter the dim, incense-scented interior, was to enter a space where the ordinary world fell away and something larger, something older, something numinous pressed close. That experience of standing in the presence of the sacred, of feeling small before something vast and beautiful, is one of the most ancient and universal of all human experiences, and it is one that connects us across all the centuries to the people who built and worshipped at the Temple of Artemis. Now, let your thoughts drift gently as a leaf drifts upon still water to the engineering marvel that lay beneath the temple's beauty. The site chosen for the Temple of Artemis was, from a structural standpoint, one of the most challenging in the ancient world. It sat on alluvial soil near the floodplain of the Cayster River, soft, marshy ground that would seem entirely unsuitable for a building of such colossal weight. And yet, the ancient builders chose this site deliberately. According to the Roman architect Vitruvius, the architects selected marshy ground specifically to protect the building from earthquakes, which were common in the seismically active region of western Anatolia. The reasoning, as Vitruvius explained it, was that the soft, waterlogged soil would absorb and dissipate the shock waves of an earthquake rather than transmitting them rigidly into the building's foundations. Modern seismic engineering confirms that this intuition had real merit. Soft soils can indeed attenuate certain types of seismic waves, though they can also amplify others, a complexity the ancients may not have fully understood. To prevent the massive temple from simply sinking into the marsh, the builders reportedly laid a foundation of charcoal and fleece, layers of compacted charcoal to provide drainage and deerskin fleeces to distribute the load. This account, again preserved by Pliny the Elder, has fascinated engineers for centuries. Whether it describes the actual technique or represents a somewhat idealized tradition, the underlying principle, creating a stable, well-drained foundation in waterlogged soil, reflects genuine engineering sophistication. The construction of the columns themselves was equally remarkable. Each column was assembled from stacked cylindrical drums of marble, precisely shaped and polished so that the joints between them were nearly invisible. The drums were connected by bronze or iron dowels set in lead, and the fluting, the vertical grooves that give Ionic columns their characteristic elegance, was carved only after the column was fully assembled and standing, to ensure perfect continuity from base to capital. Every detail bespoke a civilization that understood the marriage of beauty and precision. As you lie here in the gentle dark, breathing slowly, let us consider how the Temple of Artemis found its place among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and what that list itself can tell us about how the ancients saw their own achievements. The concept of the 7 wonders appears to have originated as a kind of ancient travel guide, a list of must-see monuments compiled for Greek-speaking travelers of the Hellenistic period. The earliest known list is sometimes attributed to the engineer Philo of Byzantium, who may have written in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era, though the text attributed to him survives only in later copies and its authorship is debated. Other ancient writers compiled their own lists, and while the specific monuments included varied somewhat, the Temple of Artemis appeared on virtually all of them. What is striking about the 7 wonders is what they reveal about ancient values. The list includes no natural wonders, no mountains, no oceans, no great forests. Every item is a human creation, a testament to what craft, ambition, and organized labor could achieve. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, whose very existence remains debated by scholars. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Together with the Temple of Artemis, these monuments represented the pinnacle of human ingenuity as the ancient Mediterranean world understood it. Of the original 7, only the Great Pyramid survives substantially intact today. The others have been destroyed by earthquake, fire, neglect, or deliberate dismantling. The Temple of Artemis, which was perhaps the most celebrated of them all during antiquity, is among the most completely vanished. Today, the site of the temple is marked by a single reconstructed column, assembled from fragments found during excavations, standing alone in a flat, marshy field near the modern Turkish town of Selçuk. It is a poignant sight, that solitary column, a single finger pointing upward, as if to remind the sky that something magnificent once stood here. There is one more thread of this story that deserves to be drawn softly through the dark, and it concerns the coins of Ephesus. For in the tiny space of a coin, we can sometimes read the story of an entire civilization. Some of the earliest coins ever minted in the Western world were produced in or near Ephesus. The invention of coinage is generally attributed to the Kingdom of Lydia, and the earliest known coins, small lumps of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, date to roughly the late 7th century before the Common Era. Several of these early electrum coins were found in the Artemision deposit, buried beneath the temple floor, making them among the oldest coins ever discovered in a controlled archaeological context. These coins are tiny, irregular things, often bearing the impression of a lion's head or a simple geometric punch mark, and yet they represent one of the most transformative inventions in human economic history. Before coinage, trade relied on barter or on weighed quantities of precious metal, which required scales and expertise to verify at every transaction. Coins standardized value. They allowed a stranger to walk into a market in a city they'd never visited and buy bread, wine, or passage on a ship, trusting that the small disc of metal in their hand was worth what the issuing authority promised. The temple's role as a repository of these coins and of the raw electrum and gold from which they were made placed it at the very center of this economic revolution. In a sense, the Temple of Artemis was not merely a witness to the birth of money. It was one of its cradles. The wealth that flowed through the sanctuary, the trust that sacred authority lent to economic transactions, the international connections that pilgrimage and trade created, all of these forces converged in the shadow of those great columns, and the coins buried beneath the temple floor are the quiet, tangible proof of that convergence. Hold that thought gently as you drift. That tiny discs of metal, no larger than a fingernail, once carried the weight of an empire's trust. Let us turn now, in these deepening hours, to the sacred landscape that surrounded the temple and gave it meaning beyond its walls. The Temple of Artemis did not exist in isolation. It was the centerpiece of a sacred precinct, a temenos, as the Greeks called it, that included altars, smaller shrines, processional ways, and ritual spaces where the festivals of Artemis were celebrated with music, dance, sacrifice, and communal feasting. The greatest of these festivals was the Artemisia, an annual celebration that drew participants from across the Greek-speaking world. During the Artemisia, athletic competitions were held, musical performances were staged, and elaborate processions wound through the streets of Ephesus and into the temple precinct. The festival was not merely a religious observance, it was a civic spectacle, a demonstration of Ephesus's wealth, culture, and devotion to its patron goddess. Inscriptions found at Ephesus describe the detailed regulations governing the festival, the order of processions, the types of sacrifices to be offered, the prizes for athletic victors, and the civic officials responsible for organizing the events. These inscriptions provide a remarkably vivid picture of ancient religious life, revealing a world in which the sacred calendar structured the rhythm of the entire year, and in which civic identity and religious devotion were woven together so tightly that they could scarcely be distinguished. The landscape around the temple also included sacred groves, wooded areas dedicated to the goddess where hunting, that most Artemisian of activities, may have been ritually practiced or symbolically invoked. The connection between Artemis and wild nature was not merely abstract theology, it was lived experience, enacted in the trees and fields and marshy waterways that surrounded her greatest sanctuary. As you breathe slowly here in the dark, you might imagine the sound of those ancient processions, the murmur of voices, the scent of burning incense and roasting meat, the distant notes of a double flute carried on the warm Ionian breeze, all converging on a temple that blazed with color under the Mediterranean sun. And so we arrive at the quiet end of our journey through the ages, where the story of the Temple of Artemis becomes something more than history. It becomes a meditation on what endures and what does not. The temple's marble has been scattered across continents. Its gold was melted and recast into forms its creators never imagined. Its columns, if they were indeed reused in Hagia Sophia or other Byzantine churches, may still bear loads today in structures dedicated to an entirely different understanding of the divine. Nothing in the physical world is truly destroyed. It is only transformed, recomposed, returned to the great slow cycle of matter that gives all things their fleeting shape. The atoms that once composed the Temple of Artemis are still here, somewhere on this earth, woven into soil and stone and water, and perhaps in some immeasurable fraction, into the air you are breathing at this very moment. What has been lost is the arrangement, the particular ordering of matter into columns and walls and painted friezes that, for a few centuries, created a space where human beings could stand in the presence of something they felt to be sacred. And yet even that arrangement is not entirely gone. It persists in the descriptions of Pliny and Strabo and Vitruvius. It persists in the fragments held in museums. It persists in the careful reconstructions of archaeologists and architects who've labored to imagine what the temple looked like in its full glory. And it persists tonight in your mind, in the images and ideas that have been gently placed there over the course of this quiet hour. The Temple of Artemis lives, in some real sense, every time a human being pauses to contemplate it. Every time someone reads an ancient text, studies a column fragment, or simply lies in the dark and wonders what it must have been like to walk between those towering columns and smell the incense and hear the distant hymns. In that moment, the temple is rebuilt, if only for the span of a thought, in the only material that truly defies time: human imagination. Consider for a moment the economic machinery that allowed a temple of such staggering proportions to exist at all. Ephesus, by the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, had become one of the wealthiest port cities in the ancient Mediterranean world, a place where merchant vessels arrived laden with goods from Egypt, Phoenicia, and the far reaches of the Black Sea. The harbor, which opened onto the Cayster River and then the Aegean beyond, was the beating heart of this prosperity. And the Temple of Artemis stood not merely as a monument to faith, but as an institution deeply woven into the fabric of commerce itself. Ancient sources, including the writings of Strabo, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, describe the temple precinct as functioning somewhat like a bank, a place where individuals and city-states alike could deposit wealth under the protection of the goddess. This practice of temple banking was not unique to Ephesus, for sanctuaries across the Greek world served similar roles, yet few commanded the same degree of trust and prestige as the great shrine of Artemis. The deposits were considered inviolable, shielded by divine authority from seizure or theft, and this sacred guarantee attracted enormous sums from across the region. Interest was charged on loans extended from these deposits, and the revenue flowed back into the maintenance and beautification of the temple grounds. In this way, the spiritual and the financial existed in a kind of quiet symbiosis, each sustaining the other across generations. Pilgrims who traveled to Ephesus for religious festivals also brought with them considerable spending power, purchasing offerings, miniature silver shrines, and other devotional objects that supported a thriving local artisan economy. The silversmith trade, in particular, became so closely linked to the temple that it is mentioned even in the Acts of the Apostles, where a craftsman named Demetrius rallied his fellow workers in defense of the goddess whose image sustained their livelihoods. And so, the temple was never merely stone and marble standing in silent reverence. It was alive with transaction, negotiation, and the gentle hum of an economy that believed prosperity itself was a form of prayer. Let us rest now with a quieter thread of this story, one that concerns the materials themselves, the very substance from which the temple was conjured into being. The columns of the later temple, the grand reconstruction undertaken after the fire of 356 BCE, were carved from luminous white marble quarried from the surrounding hills of western Anatolia. Marble, in the ancient world, was far more than a building material. It was a statement of permanence, of ambition, of a desire to create something that might outlast the frailties of human memory. Pliny the Elder, writing in his natural history in the 1st century of the Common Era, noted that the temple contained 127 columns, each standing approximately 60 feet tall, and that 36 of these bore elaborate sculptural reliefs at their bases, a feature known as columnae caelatae. These carved drums depicted mythological scenes and divine figures rendered in stone with extraordinary delicacy, and some fragments of them survive today in the British Museum, where they rest in softly lit galleries far from the Anatolian sun that once warmed them. Imagine the years of labor required to shape each column, to transport each drum from quarry to temple site, to raise each shaft upright and cap it with its ionic capital, those graceful scrolling volutes that curled like the memory of ocean waves frozen in stone. The architraves that spanned the tops of these columns were themselves colossal blocks of marble, and ancient accounts describe the near miraculous engineering required to lift them into place. One story, preserved by several Roman-era writers, tells of the architect growing so anxious about positioning the largest lintel stone above the doorway that he contemplated ending his own life, only to find in the morning that the stone had settled perfectly into position during the night, an event attributed to the intervention of Artemis herself. Whether or not this tale holds any literal truth, it speaks to the psychological weight of the project, the immense pressure felt by those who dared to build something worthy of a goddess. And so each column, each carved relief, each carefully fitted stone was not merely construction, but an act of devotion measured in decades. There is a particular sadness that belongs to ruins, a kind of tenderness that settles over places where something magnificent once stood, and now only fragments remain. The site of the Temple of Artemis today lies in a marshy lowland near the modern Turkish town of Selçuk. And what greets the visitor is startlingly modest. A single reconstructed column rising from a shallow, reedy pool, assembled from recovered drums and standing as a lonely sentinel over what was once one of the most celebrated structures in all of human civilization. The rest lies beneath centuries of accumulated silt deposited by the slow migration of the Cayster River, which over the millennia gradually shifted the coastline westward, leaving the once thriving harbor of Ephesus stranded several kilometers inland. This geological process, quiet and relentless, achieved what fire and conquest could not entirely accomplish. It erased the context in which the temple had meaning, removing the harbor, the merchant ships, the flow of pilgrims, and the economic energy that had sustained the sanctuary for centuries. Archaeological excavations at the site began in earnest in 1869, led by the British engineer John Turtle Wood, who spent years searching for the temple's exact location with a determination that bordered on obsession. After more than 6 years of difficult and often fruitless digging in swampy terrain, Wood finally uncovered the temple's foundation platform, buried beneath roughly 20 feet of sediment. Later excavations by David George Hogarth in the early 20th century revealed votive deposits and artifacts from multiple phases of the temple's history, including small golden figurines and delicate ivory carvings that hinted at the extraordinary richness of what had been lost. These objects, now scattered among museums in London and Istanbul, are the whispered remnants of a world that once pulsed with color, incense, and song. And yet, even in its absence, the temple exerts a strange gravitational pull on the imagination. We return to it again and again, in books and lectures and quiet nights like this one, because it represents something essential about what human beings are willing to build when they believe the effort will be seen by something greater than themselves. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson the Temple of Artemis offers to those of us lying still in the gentle dark, listening to the story of its rise and disappearance. It is a lesson not about permanence, but about the beauty of impermanence, about the strange and luminous courage it takes to build something extraordinary while knowing, on some level, that time will eventually unmake it. The ancient Ephesians who laid those foundations, who carved those reliefs and raised those towering columns toward the Anatolian sky, did not possess any illusion of eternity. They had already watched one temple burn and committed themselves to building another, larger and more magnificent than the first. They understood that creation is not a single act, but a continual conversation with loss, a willingness to begin again, to pour meaning into materials that the earth will one day reclaim. This understanding echoes through other traditions as well. In Japanese aesthetics, there is a concept known as mono-no-aware, sometimes translated as the pathos of things, which describes the bittersweet awareness that beauty is inseparable from its transience. The cherry blossom is cherished not despite the fact that it falls, but because it falls, and something similar may be said of the great wonders of the ancient world. They move us precisely because they are gone, because their absence creates a space that our imagination rushes to fill with light and color and longing. As your breathing deepens now and your thoughts begin to loosen their grip on the waking world, let the image of that single column in its quiet marsh settle gently behind your eyes. It does not ask you to mourn what was lost. It asks only that you notice how beautiful it is that anything was built at all, that human hands once shaped marble into prayer, that a goddess was honored with the finest work a civilization could offer, and that the memory of that offering still drifts through the night air like the faintest trace of ancient incense. The temple is gone, yes, but the impulse that created it, the desire to reach beyond ourselves towards something luminous and enduring, that impulse lives on in every act of wonder, including this quiet moment now. Let us consider now the river that ran beside the temple, the Caister, whose slow and silted waters carried with them a quieter kind of destruction than any flame. For Ephesus was, in its earliest centuries, a city defined by its proximity to the sea, a harbour town whose wealth depended upon ships arriving laden with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. And yet the Caister, winding through the Anatolian lowlands, deposited fine sediments year after year, century after century, gradually extending the coastline outward, pushing the sea further and further from the city's reach. By the Roman period, engineers had already attempted to dredge the harbour, to hold back the slow encroachment of earth upon water. But rivers are patient forces, and their work cannot easily be undone. The silting of the harbour at Ephesus was not a sudden catastrophe, but a creeping diminishment, a loss measured not in days, but in generations. Where once great trading vessels had anchored within sight of the temple's gleaming colonnade, marshland began to form, breeding mosquitoes and the fevers they carried. The economic vitality that had sustained the temple's priesthood, its festivals, its constant program of renovation and embellishment, began to wane as trade routes shifted to more accessible ports. And so the temple lost not only its political protectors, but its economic foundation, the steady flow of commerce and pilgrimage that had kept its marble clean and its rituals unbroken for hundreds of years. This is a pattern repeated throughout the ancient world, the slow geological betrayal of cities that had once seemed eternal. Miletus, not far to the south, suffered a similar fate, its harbours filling with silt until the sea became a distant memory. These were not failures of human will or imagination, but reminders that even the grandest constructions exist at the mercy of processes far older and more persistent than any civilization. The Caister did not intend to destroy Ephesus, of course. It simply carried soil from the mountains to the plains, as it had done for millions of years before the first stone was ever quarried for the temple. There is another chapter we might gently unfold, one that concerns what the temple meant not merely to those who worshipped within it, but to those who simply passed by, travelers and merchants and soldiers who glimpsed its columns from the road and felt, for a moment, the strange compression of awe and insignificance that sacred architecture is designed to produce. Ancient accounts tell us that the temple stood on a raised platform, a crepidoma of broad steps, and that its forest of columns, said to number 127 in the final reconstruction attributed to the architect whose name some sources give as Chirocrates or Dinocrates, created a kind of twilight within even at midday. Imagine arriving at Ephesus after weeks at sea, your ship rocking in the harbour, the salt still clinging to your skin, and there before you, rising above the rooftops and the market stalls, stood this monument of such scale that the mind could not quite hold it. The columns alone were roughly 18 meters tall, each one the height of a 6-story building, and many of the lower drums were adorned with sculptural reliefs, a feature so unusual that the Greeks had a specific term for such columns, columnae kelatai, carved columns that blurred the boundary between architecture and art. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History in the 1st century of the Common Era, noted that 36 of these columns bore such sculptural decoration, gifts from kings and patrons who wished their generosity to be literally carved into the structure of the divine. Consider the effect of walking among those columns, your footsteps echoing against marble, the light filtering down in pale shafts through the spaces between, the scent of incense drifting from the inner sanctuary where the cult statue of Artemis stood in her strange and ancient form. This was not merely a building, it was an orchestrated experience of the senses, a slow unfolding of wonder designed to prepare the visitor for an encounter with something greater than themselves. And perhaps that is what we lose most completely when a temple falls, not the stone or the gold, but the lived experience of moving through space made sacred by human intention. And yet, the temple did not vanish all at once. Its decline was a slow exhalation stretched across centuries as the world around it changed in ways that no amount of marble could resist. When the Roman Empire formally adopted Christianity under Theodosius I in the late 4th century of the Common Era, the old pagan sanctuaries across the Mediterranean entered a long twilight. Theodosius issued a series of decrees, culminating in those of 391 and 392, that prohibited pagan sacrifice and ordered the closure of temples throughout the empire. Whether the Temple of Artemis was formally closed by imperial decree or simply abandoned as its worshippers dwindled remains a matter of scholarly discussion, but the effect was the same. The great sanctuary, already diminished by the loss of trade and the shifting of political power, found itself without the community of belief that had sustained it for so many centuries. What followed was not dramatic destruction, but something more melancholy, a gradual scavenging of materials. Marble columns were carted away to be reused in churches and civic buildings. Some of the green jasper columns from the temple's final incarnation are believed to have been transported to Constantinople, where they were incorporated into the Hagia Sophia, consecrated in 537 under Emperor Justinian. If this attribution is correct, and some art historians consider it plausible though not proven, then fragments of the temple still stand today, embedded in the walls of one of the most celebrated buildings on earth, transformed from pagan sanctuary to Christian cathedral to Ottoman mosque to modern museum. There is something deeply moving in this thought, that stone cut for Artemis might still bear the weight of Justinian's dome, that sacred material might outlive the faith for which it was first quarried. The earth, too, reclaimed what it could. Floods deposited layers of silt over the temple platform. The marble that remained was slowly buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil. By the medieval period, the exact location of the temple had been forgotten entirely, its memory preserved only in texts that fewer and fewer people read. It was not until the 19th century that the temple was found again, and the story of its rediscovery carries its own quiet drama. John Turtle Wood, a British architect and engineer who had been working on railway stations for the Ottoman government, became convinced that the temple could be located beneath the swampy ground near the village of Ayasoluk, close to modern-day Selçuk in Turkey. He began excavating in 1863, funded by the British Museum, and for 6 long years he dug through waterlogged soil and accumulated debris without finding the temple itself. Consider the persistence this required, season after season of trenches yielding Roman roads and Byzantine walls, but not the prize he sought. The constant struggle against rising groundwater that flooded his excavations, the skepticism of those who wondered if the temple would ever be found at all. It was on the 31st of December, 1869, that Wood's workers finally struck the pavement of the great temple, some 6 meters beneath the surface. 6 meters of history had accumulated above those sacred stones, centuries compressed into layers of silt and rubble and forgotten time. What Wood uncovered was fragmentary but unmistakable, portions of the temple platform, sections of sculptured column drums, and architectural elements that confirmed the descriptions left by ancient writers. Many of these finds were shipped to the British Museum in London, where they remain today, quiet witnesses in glass cases far from the Anatolian sun that once warmed them. Later excavations, particularly those led by David George Hogarth in 1904 and 1905, uncovered still more, including deposits of precious offerings, tiny gold and ivory figurines, coins and jewelry that pilgrims had left for the goddess across many centuries. Beneath the foundations of the later temple, Hogarth found evidence of the earlier structures, confirming that the site had been sacred long before the monumental temple of the 6th century, before the Common Era was ever conceived. Today, a single reconstructed column stands at the site, reassembled from fragments, rising alone above a shallow reflecting pool that forms when the rains come. A solitary gesture toward a grandeur that once astonished the ancient world. Consider what it meant for the archaeologists who first brushed the sediment away from those buried stones. The British engineer John Turtle Wood had spent years searching, funded by the British Museum, and by the time he finally uncovered the temple's foundations in 1869, he had endured malaria, knife wounds, and the quiet, persistent skepticism of those who believed the temple was lost beyond recovery. What he found was not a palace of gleaming marble, but a waterlogged depression, a pavement buried beneath 20 feet of alluvial silt carried down from the surrounding hills over centuries of flooding. The columns that had once stood more than 60 feet tall were gone, broken apart by time, by gravity, by the patient work of local builders who had repurposed the stone for walls and cisterns and doorsteps. And yet the fragments that remained told a story of astonishing craft. Sculptured column drums, some bearing traces of figures in low relief, were recovered from the mire and shipped to London, where they can still be seen today in the British Museum's collection. Later excavations, led by David George Hogarth at the turn of the 20th century, revealed deposits of gold, ivory, amber and electrum buried beneath the temple floor, offerings that had accumulated across generations of worship. These tiny objects, some no larger than a thumbnail, spoke of intimate devotion, of individuals pressing small treasures into the earth as prayers made material. Among them were coins from the kingdom of Lydia, believed to be among the earliest coins ever struck, reinforcing the deep connection between the temple and the invention of currency itself. Ephesus was a place where the sacred and the economic were woven together so tightly that to separate them would be to misunderstand the ancient world entirely. Each small artifact pulled from the mud was a whisper from someone who had once stood in the temple's shadow, heart full of longing or gratitude, placing something precious into the keeping of the goddess, trusting that the offering would endure long after the hand that gave it had turned to dust and silence. There is something worth holding gently in the mind as sleep draws closer, and it is the idea that the Temple of Artemis was never truly one building. It was a conversation that lasted 1,000 years, a dialogue between human aspiration and the indifferent turning of the world. The first sacred structure on that site may have been little more than a wooden shrine, a simple enclosure around a sacred tree or a meteorite that the people of early Ephesus believed had fallen from the heavens. Over the centuries, that modest beginning was rebuilt and enlarged, each generation adding its own layer of ambition and reverence, until the archaic temple of the 6th century BCE rose under the patronage of King Croesus of Lydia, whose legendary wealth-funded columns of unprecedented height. When Herostratus burned that temple in 356 BCE, the people of Ephesus did not abandon the site. They built again, and the version that Alexander the Great reportedly offered to finance was even grander than the one before, though the Ephesians politely declined his offer, preferring to fund the reconstruction themselves. This final great temple stood for roughly 600 years before the slow forces of history dismantled it, piece by piece. And so the temple was not a single moment frozen in stone, but a living process, a rhythm of creation and loss and creation again, not so different from the rhythm of breath that moves through you now, each exhalation releasing what came before, each inhalation drawing in something new. The stones are scattered now across museums and riverbeds and the foundations of Byzantine churches, but the idea of the temple persists, carried forward in the written accounts of Pliny the Elder, in the wonder lists of Antipater of Sidon, and in the quiet imaginations of all who hear its story and allow it to take shape behind closed eyes. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of Ephesus, that nothing built by human hands is permanent, and yet nothing truly cherished is ever entirely lost, for it passes from stone into memory, and from memory into dream, where it may stand forever. And now the temple fades, as all things must, into the warm and welcoming dark. The columns dissolve, the painted friezes blur and soften, the incense smoke thins to nothing, and the ancient hymns grow quiet, and all that remains is the gentle rhythm of your breathing, steady and slow, like waves against a distant shore. You have traveled far tonight, across centuries, across seas, into the heart of a vanished world. And now it is time to rest. Let the knowledge you have gathered settle gently into your mind like sediment into still water, finding its place among your other thoughts, becoming part of who you are. The temple is safe within you now, and you are safe within this night. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your body grow heavy. Let sleep come as softly and surely as the tide. If this journey brought you peace tonight, you might consider leaving a quiet like, or sharing this story with someone who could use a gentle night. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so that we can meet here again tomorrow, beneath another sky, inside another wonder. Thank you for spending your night with Let's Learn while you sleep. Subscribe and come back tomorrow night. We'll be here. Sleep well.